On behalf of the Chamber, I'd like to welcome you to the Brazil Summit webinar. First and foremost, I wanted to wish everybody good health, and I hope you're all well and sheltering in place and keeping yourself protected in this very difficult time. Second, I wanted to thank PwC for sponsoring this event. They're letting us use their infrastructure, which can accommodate many more people than our own. And we really do appreciate their sponsors. We also have a person on from their New York office, Alexis Crow. We really have an exciting program for you today. First, we're going to start off with our keynote speaker, Mansueto Almeida, Treasury Secretary of Brazil. Next, Paulo Vieira da Cunha is going to, from Verbank, going to coordinate a panel discussion, which includes Will Landers, Alexis Crow, Cassiana Fernandez, and Chris Garland. Without further ado, let me quickly give a small introduction to Mansueto Almeida. Just 2 points. First, if you want the full bios, they are on a link in your invitation and also on our website. And second, when we get to the question and answer, there is a small place chat at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your questions, and we'll coordinate the questions that way. And you can do them throughout the discussion, and then at the end of first Treasury Secretary Mansueto's talk, and then with the panel, we will answer them in due course. So Secretary Mansueto Almeida has had the position of Treasury Secretary since April 2018. He has been at IPEA as a public servant and researcher since 1997, and clearly he has held many important positions, not only in this government and prior governments as well. It's hard to think of somebody that knows the Brazilian fiscal account better than Mansueto. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Mansueto. Mansueto?
Hi, John. Thank you very much for to be here with you all to debate a little bit about the economic situation of Brazil and to give you some update about how we are dealing with the coronavirus crisis. First, let me start by saying that, of course, the fiscal numbers here in Brazil today, this year, will be a little bit worse than we were expecting at the beginning of the year, because we're in the middle of a very, very serious economic and social crisis linked to the health problem, to the coronavirus problem. And this is not unique to Brazil. This problem, it's a world problem. We've seen many countries, many different countries going through the same problems. And this year, everybody needs to deal with that. Meaning that the fiscal consolidation plan that was in Brazil, we need to stop a little bit this year to deal with the coronavirus crisis. But it's very, very important. It's very important that all the increase in public sector expenditure this year must be restricted to this fiscal year, because we are dealing with a temporary crisis. We should not increase permanent expenditure. And this is our key strategy here in Brazil. Our target is we need to spend whatever it takes, whatever it's necessary to help the health system and to help the low-income workers and workers that were in the informal sector. So the fiscal consolidation plan now, we had to make a stop to deal with the crisis. But every increase in the public sector expenditure is linked to temporary expenditure. We are not contaminating. We are avoiding any increase in permanent expenditure, meaning that in the next year, we are back to the fiscal consolidation plan, complying with the spending cap bill. And this is very, very important. It's the most important message. And I think everybody here in Brazil, including politicians in the lower and upper house, they understand that. The lower house 2 weeks ago approved a kind of a constitutional amendment drafting what we call a budget for the coronavirus war. And in this new constitutional amendment, they allow us to be more flexible in open fiscal space to increase temporary expenditure. We don't have the permission of the Congress, to be more flexible, to increase permanent expenditure. And this is very, very good because, I mean, the Congress understood that it's key to Brazil to comply with the spend cap bill. We should not, you should not increase expenditure linked to permanent expenditure. I think that's the key point. In terms of the numbers, last year you had a very good outcome because it was the first time after 5 years that Brazil was able to cut the gross debt to GDP. And we were expecting that in this presidential mandate, we would be able to stabilize or even cut a little bit the gross debt to GDP. But now things changed because, of course, since you have worse fiscal number this year, the growth of the growth of the gross and the net debt will be higher. And this is not a problem because, again, we need to comply with the spend cap bill, meaning that the growth of the public sector expenditure in Brazil is controlled. In addition to that, we have, this year we have some positive news different from previous crises in Brazil, like 2015, 2008, 2002. That in 2015, for instance, when we had a recession in Brazil, 2015 and 2016, the market interest rate in Brazil were very, very high. The Selic, which the basic interest rate in Brazil was higher than 14% per year. Now the Selic, the market interest rate in Brazil, it's 3.75. So I mean, although we will have by the end of this year a higher debt, the interest rate is very, very low. And have in mind that in Brazil, 50% of the public sector debt is financed in the short term, is directly linked to the short-term interest rate. So although my debt is getting higher, the cost of the debt it's in a minimal, it's in a very low historical rate, which is good, which will help us to deal with the higher debt after the crisis. And of course, I mean, since you all know that we're in the middle of a process of approving very important reforms in Brazil, including privatization, new concessions, tax reform, administrative reform. And if those reforms were important before the crisis, it will become even more important after the crisis. So you really need to make a strong effort to build the political consensus to continue with the reformist agenda after the crisis, because this will be key to control the gross debt to GDP, to help us in the gross debt dynamics. So, I mean, pretty much, I think nothing changed. Here in Brazil, many people were worried about criticizing the economic team because people thought that you were very, very liberal and you had some, difficult to deal with the crisis, and it doesn't make sense at all. Being liberal doesn't mean being stupid. And in a crisis like this, we need to spend more. There is no doubt about that. We need to spend more to help the health system, to protect low-income workers and workers who lost, the revenue because they were in the informal sector. And third, to help firms to maintain the employment. And you're doing all this free, increase the expenditure to deal with all these free challenges. As we see all over the world. Up to now, at the beginning of the year, we're expecting a public sector deficit around 1.5% of GDP, around 120 billion reais, and now we are heading to something between 500 billion reais and 600 billion reais. We're heading to a primary deficit that will be close up to now to 8% of GDP. That is very, very high. We know that. But again, this comes from an increase in temporary expenditure and loss of revenue. This will not, continue next year. So that's the key difference. That's the key difference from any other, crisis that Brazil went through. It's very, very important in this crisis, and you've been very careful about that to avoid the same mistakes that Brazil did dealing with the crisis in 2008 and 2009. Remember that in 2008, 2009, you had the world financial crisis, and Brazil increased the public sector expenditure and put in place a lot of programs through public banks to help the private sector, through the National Development Bank. But the mistake that the Brazilian government did in 2009 was to transform temporary programs into permanent one. You're not going to do that again. It's impossible to do that again because you don't have fiscal space to do that. And again, the Congress didn't allow us to do that. The Congress just allowed us to increase expenditure financed by a higher debt to pay for temporary expenditure. That's the key. I mean, that's the key point that we need to have in mind. From the part of the Treasury, we'll publish new reports saying exactly how each cent of the Brazilian taxpayer has been spent to deal with the coronavirus crisis. So I intend to give full transparency, full information to make it easier for the press and also for any Brazilian to follow how much we're spending and on what we are spending. So pretty much, I think that, if you make clear the bill and how the money has been spent to deal with the coronavirus crisis, you'll be, even you have the population as our allies to curb any kind of temptation to increase the permanent expenditure. And I think, that's really the key message. Today you were sending to the Congress the basic guidelines for the next year budget, meaning that we need to send today to the Congress the fiscal target for next year. And pretty much, it'll be very easy, to set on the proposal the expenditure, the public sector expenditure, the central government expenditure for next year, because it'll be exactly the one that is allowed by the spending cap bill. What will be very, very uncertainty is to set a target for the revenue, because this is linked to the GDP growth, to the tax base this year and next year. And today is very, very difficult to have a good estimate about the GDP growth this year and the next year, and also the tax base. But again, we will update this number that you sent to the Congress today, and the uncertainty is not coming from the expenditure side. It's coming from the revenue side, because nobody knows, how much the GDP will fall this year in Brazil or in the world. And, and the next year as well. Next year, the GDP in Brazil will increase by 2%, 3%, or lower than that. Nobody knows at this point. That's why, many people in the financial market and economic analysts are running the models every single week. And every single week, you have a different number for GDP. We need to continue to do that, because, at this point, we're not very sure how long the lockdown in Brazil will last. At one hand, we started the lockdown in major cities in Brazil before many other cities in the United States and also in Europe. And again, I hope that we don't need to spend 3 months at home. Today, I'm almost 1 month without leaving my apartment. It's really bad, but it's necessary to deal with the coronavirus crisis. Probably, I don't know how much I will need to stay here for 1 month more, 2 more months. It's uncertainty. But, probably you may, in the coming weeks, you have a clear idea how long we'll need to stay at home. But again, I think Brazil put a lot of policies in place to deal quite well with the coronavirus crisis for 3 months. If you have to stay more than that, if the lockdown is, if you need to extend the lockdown to over 3 months, then we need to go back to the table and and see how you're going to amplify, to increase the programs that we put in place to deal with the coronavirus crisis for 3 months. But pretty much now, I think we're heading this year, as I told, to a primary deficit near 8% of GDP, because of this package to help states and subnational government that was approved 2 days ago in the lower house. So in my numbers now are closer to 600 billion reais, which is 8% of GDP of primary deficit, and probably a gross debt to GDP, something around 85 to 90% of GDP. Can we deal with that after the crisis? Of course, we can deal with that. But we need to approve reform. We need to approve reform to increase the potential GDP growth of the Brazilian economy, because this will help us a lot to control the gross debt to GDP dynamics. That's the main challenge. I don't see any pressure coming from the Congress. The Congress sometimes wanted to increase a little bit the help that federal government needs to provide to subnational government. But I don't see any pressure coming from the Congress to increase permanent expenditure. I think everybody here is aware that our most important fiscal anchor in Brazil is the spend cap bill. And the way that I see is that we don't see any complaint, we don't see any challenger to the spend cap bill, which is a rule that was approved back in 2016 that says that until 2026, the central government expenditure cannot increase higher than inflation, meaning that zero real growth of the public sector expenditure. So pretty much understand that this is a key rule to Brazil for the Brazilian government to comply with, because otherwise, we will not be able to consolidate this good scenario of very, very low inflation and very low interest rates. So pretty much, if you consolidate this scenario of low inflation, low interest rates, together with the economic reforms that increase the potential GDP growth of the Brazilian economy, I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to deal with the bill that you need to pay after the coronavirus crisis. That's the challenge. Again, we started this crisis in a very polarized situation, because there was still a strong political polarization here in Brazil. But again, the way that I see is that everybody, it doesn't matter if you are pro-government or if you don't like the government, but the way that I see is that the Congress, even the Supreme Court, everybody is getting together to help to deal with the crisis. So, I don't expect you have some kind of disagreement, because sometimes, the Congress wants to spend a little bit more than we want in the short term, in temporary expenditure, but pretty much everybody agrees that we need to preserve, you need to make sure that we will comply with the spend cap bill. And this is the most important thing, because this is the most important fiscal anchor that Brazil has today, and which means a very gradual fiscal adjustment plan. So pretty much, at this point, I'm quite, I'm not happy because we are in the middle of a crisis and the numbers will be worse. But on the other hand, I'm happy because different from 2008, 2009, and different from previous, crises in Brazil, we are dealing with the crisis, focusing on temporary expenditure and very three important points. As I told, help the health system to get whatever it needs to deliver the service to protect the population. Second, try to protect the low-income workers and workers who came from the informal sector. And third, provide some help for small, medium, and large enterprise to maintain employment. And the last point that I wanted to stress is that here in Brazil, different from many other countries, have in mind that in Brazil, we already had, before the crisis, a very large welfare state. You know that Brazil has a tax burden around 33% of GDP, which is very, very high for a Latin America country. The average tax burden in Latin America is around 22, 23% of GDP. So Brazil has a tax burden that is much higher than the average for Latin America. And have in mind that Brazil has a very, very wide welfare state. In Brazil, until last year, in average, people get retired around 54, 55 years old. This is very, very young. So I think you have many people who are not working, but, got pension. This is different from many other countries, from many developed countries. Here in Brazil, if you're talking about someone with 60 years old who is in the countryside of north, northeast, south, or southeast, it doesn't matter, that person probably is retired. That person gets a pension from the government. So from many other places, it's in a hurry to build a social assistance, arm, to build a welfare state, to reach those low-income workers. Here in Brazil, pretty much, we're already spending, I would say, a lot compared to other developing countries on social assistance and pension. So, this pretty much, gave me some kind of, make us a little bit optimistic that the state will be able to reach whoever it needs to reach to provide some income to deal with the coronavirus crisis. And that's the good news. And in addition to that, have in mind also, different from many other developing countries, that Brazil has a universal health system, a universal public health system that we call SUS. And again, although it's not as good as the one in England, but it's very, very good compared to all the other developing countries. So pretty much we have the technology, we have the know-how that if any single municipality in Brazil or state needs additional money to help to deal with the crisis, to get additional resources to fund a new expenditure linked to the health system, we can do that easily and very fast, providing extra budget to the Minister of Health that you do that transferring to any state and any municipality in Brazil. Our universal health system gave us this technology to very, very fast, quickly to reach any place in the country. So pretty much, this is another, positive point that we don't see in many other developing countries. So pretty much, I think, it's challenging, it's difficult to deal with the crisis, but I think the federal government is taking the right steps. Of course, there is some delay, as it's happening all over the world. If you see all the programs that the United States government announced, you see that there is some kind of delay for the programs really to become effective. And this is not different in Brazil, and it's not different all over the world. But pretty much, I think, now we are in the right course to deal with the crisis. To finish my initial remarks, many people are a little bit afraid and asking about, okay, how are we going to raise the money to pay all this temporary expenditure? Because although it's temporary expenditures, we need the money to pay this expenditure. And the good news, again, is that, at the beginning of the year, we had a huge cash cushion in the Treasury that make it possible for us to stay, away of the market for many months. So I'm not in a hurry to go back to the market to raise money to sell public bonds, because we had a very, very comfortable cash cushion at the beginning of the year. So, this allows me to stay away from the market for some months. And of course, at some point, probably in the second semester, the Treasury, will need to go back to the market in a more aggressive way to raise money, to ask taxpayers and everybody else to lend us money to pay the bill. But pretty much, right now we are in a quite comfortable position. I'm not in a hurry to raise money. And again, despite the crisis, long-term interest rate in Brazil right now it's a little bit lower than 8% per year. And this is half what it used to be, at the beginning of 2016. Again, at the beginning of 2016, the long-term interest rate in Brazil were around 16% per year. Now it's a little bit lower than 8%. It is still high. It's higher than what it was 1 month ago, 2 months ago, 6 months ago. It's higher. But again, we're talking about an interest rate that is half of what it was 4 years ago in Brazil. And short-term interest rate, is very, very important to the cost of the debt, is still very, very low. Again, so I don't see any problem in terms of finance, in terms of raising the money that we need to raise to pay the expenditure. Pretty much, things are, this year we don't need to be too much concerned with the primary deficit, because this is something that will happen all over the world. But again, we need to be very careful to not pay a bill more than what is really necessary to deal with the crisis. And I'm stressing that a lot. We need to have a good political dialogue. Probably I'm the one here in Brazil that every time I'm asking people to become a little bit calm and come to the table and have a good political debate. We don't need to agree with everyone else, is proposing, but we need to have a very transparent, a very good political dialogue to avoid to pay a bill higher than what is really necessary to deal with the coronavirus crisis. So basically, that's my initial remarks. I'm open to Q&A, and then we can, provide some information and stress, other points that I missed in these initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Mansueto. Just to remind everyone, if you have a question, please put it at the bottom of, there's a place at the bottom to send the questions in. And then we already have quite a few. But let me just take the opportunity in my position as moderator to ask you something. You talked about the emergency actions that you've taken. I think the total amount for the quick to try to help the poor, so the poor, et cetera, came out to about 680 billion reais. There's also a bill in Congress that has your name on it. I don't think it really is associated anymore with you, that has to deal with relief for the states and municipal governments. Can you go just a little bit into that? I know you've been working to try to get the states and municipal governments to adjust. And as you said, the fiscal side is sort of out the window right now. Really, the emergency is here and we have to spend. But can you talk just a little bit about that and how you're trying to keep, the incentives right, at least for the states and municipal governments?
Okay, that's a good point. First of all, we were debating last week about this emergency plan to help the state. And 1 year ago, I presented to the Congress a plan to help states to do the fiscal adjustment. It was a typical IMF program that would allow states to get new loans with the guarantee of the Treasury. But in exchange for that, they will need to present a kind of fiscal plan to 3-4 years and every single year we would monitor whether or not they were complying with the fiscal plan, and if they did, they got the additional installments. You would release you would allow them to get a loan with the guarantee of the Treasury, but the loan would be released in installments, a typical IMF program. But suddenly now we have to deal with the crisis. I think. Despite the goodwill of many states in Brazil and municipalities, they could not stop for 3-4 months to draft a fiscal plan, a fiscal adjustment plan. So pretty much, we put my original plan, the PLP 149, that people started to call my name. I don't like that, but people started calling Plano Mansueto. But we put that original plan on a hold, and the Congress presented a completely different plan, which is an emergency plan. And no problem with that. The only thing that we wanted to discuss a little bit better with the Congress, that the way that the project was approved in the lower house, it increased the bill, the help to the state for 6 months. It gave a kind of insurance, a kind of guarantee that states and cities in Brazil, it doesn't matter how much they you lose for the revenue that the federal government needs to make a transfer to compensate for the whole revenue that they lose in the coming 6 months. And we think this is too much. I think this is too much because, we don't have even the concrete number, because it's a kind of, it's an open number. Because if for some reason states lose more than 30% of their revenue, we need to compensate for that. And also on the project that was approved in the lower house, there is an article that says that states and municipalities, you're not allowed to give any kind of fiscal incentive, but you can give fiscal incentives to help small and medium, small enterprises, and also to try to maintain the employment in firms. This is very open because you can give any kind of fiscal incentives and justify by saying that this is very important to maintain the employment. We need to change that because otherwise, the risk to increase even more the bill to the federal government in new transfer is very, very high. Again, it's a question of political debate. We need to sit with the congressmen and try to explain our side and also hear their side and also to hear the side of governors. But our proposal is that, okay, we understand that we need to make some transfers to states and municipalities. Let's do that. Let's do some free transfer not linked to specific expenditures to some states and municipalities, but we want a lower number. And if besides that, some states and some municipalities want to further transfer to deal with the coronavirus crisis in the health system, we can do that. But again, we not take for granted that the coronavirus crisis and the people who will go to the hospital will be the same in every single city and state in Brazil, because this is not the case. This is not the case in all over the world. Look to what is happening in the United States. We know that the coronavirus crisis in New York is much serious than it is in Texas. So we cannot have the same policies for New York and Texas because the effect is quite different. So probably we'll try to have a negotiation, talking with the Congress to try to convince them that, okay, let's put in place a transfer for 3 months, not for 6 months, to state and municipalities. And which is lower than what it was approved in the lower house. And let's put additional fiscal space to help state and municipalities, those ones who need most to deal, with the pressure on the local health system. And we don't know yet in which place the pressure will be higher or lower. So, we need to, part of the transfer needs to be linked to the pressure of the local health system. That's the points that we will try to defend on the Congress. And again, let's do it for 3 months. After 3 months, as things continue the same or get worse, let's go back to the table to negotiate. Because, if you look what is happening all over the world, I don't see, in any place that the quarantine or lockdown has been going through over 3 months. And in Brazil, we started this process quite early. We started this process, 1 month ago. So Brazil started the lockdown 1 month ago, and now yesterday was the peak of the number of deaths linked to the coronavirus, and it was 200. It's high, it could get even worse, but again, since we started the process of locking down before many other countries and cities, probably here in Brazil, the number of deaths will not be as high as we see in many other places. But let's see. But again, what's our disagreement with the Congress in this package to help states? The major disagreement, it's the size of the bill. You are disagreeing about 0.8% of GDP. And second, we want some kind of extra control to avoid that the money is spent in a different way that we expect. You wanted to put in the law something like, listen, let's make a kind of commitment that nobody will increase civil servant wage for the next 2 years. Let's put a commitment that, we'll control the budget of independent powers, the amount that the executive power at every single state needs to transfer to the justice, to the local Congress, to the independent accounting office, etc. So you wanted to put there some kinds of control to make it sure that the money is spent on the right way. But it's a political debate, and I do believe in a good political debate.
Thank you, Mansueto. I go to some of the questions, and some of them are related to what you just spoke about. Talking of Congress and politics, what do you think at this point the long-term priorities for Congress are? I guess maybe long-term is the election in October. But anyway, there's a question of what you think is still on the agenda in Congress, especially with structural reforms, tax reform, et cetera. I know they're on hold, but what is your sense of where Congress is going to go on all the issues, I guess, for the long term?
Okay, right now nobody's talking about structural reforms because everybody's quite worried about, what kind of program can we put in place to deal with the coronavirus crisis and the speed of delivery, the actual programs that were already approved. So pretty much people are much more concerned on how to deal with the coronavirus crisis and the speed of the public sector to deliver what was already approved. But having said that, I think pretty much everybody here in Brazil, knows the importance of continue with the structural reforms after the crisis. First of all, some people here in Brazil, I think as well in many other places, we're talking about a kind of a Marshall Plan to try to foster the GDP growth after the coronavirus crisis. And we don't have a fiscal space to do a Marshall Plan. We don't have the power of the public sector to increase public investment after this crisis. And our situation after the crisis will be the same before the crisis. We need to rely on private investment, to do all the investment that Brazil needs to do to increase, to improve the infrastructure. So pretty much, I think after the crisis, we need to speed up all the process of privatization, all the concessions, and again, improve the regulatory framework to invite the private sector to come and to do the investment. I think there will be challenges, and I think after the crisis, the private sector will be looking all over the world for good investment opportunities, and I think this is very, very key to Brazil. To present a very good regulatory framework and a timetable to do the concession, the privatization, to attract foreign capital and private capital to do the investment. If reforms were already important 1 year ago, it will be even more and more important after the crisis, because otherwise, you have problems to pay the bill. And one thing that will help us to pay the bill of the coronavirus crisis is higher GDP growth. And in order to have a higher GDP growth, we need to do the reforms. We need to increase investment. And in order to increase investment, you need the help of the private sector, because the public sector will not have the means to increase sharply the public investment. Second, we need to improve our tax system. Brazil has a very, very complex tax system, and we need to improve our tax system. And as far as I know, I haven't seen in many, many years, probably in decades, a Congress so much engaged in trying to approve, in trying to build a political consensus to approve a tax reform. So pretty much, I think that after the crisis, I think we will have the support of the Congress, because the Congress was already interested in building a consensus to approve a tax reform. And I think, all this debate linked to tax reform, administrative reform, improve the regulatory framework to attract private capital, to infrastructure investment, etc., everything, I mean, goes back to the agenda. You'll be the key points in the agenda next year. In the meantime, I think the government has to speed up all the modeling process linked to privatization, especially to link it to Eletrobras, because after the crisis, when the market gets better, we need to hurry to do the privatization of Eletrobras. So, I mean, I think the government, part of the government that is not dealing daily with the crisis, needs to take this time to even go faster in the modeling process to get ready, to make everything ready, that once the market gets better, to speed up the process of privatization. Again, I mean, just to sum up, I think the structural reforms will be very important next year and will be the key point in our agenda, because otherwise, it's the only thing that can decrease the cost of paying the bill of the coronavirus crisis. Higher growth will be very important in terms of revenue and in terms of debt to GDP dynamics.
Thank you. You answered one of the questions I was going to ask you, especially about returning to privatization. That's important. But we do have a short-term revenue shortfall, either because of the recession that's coming in. Clearly, if you're thinking about 8% of GDP as I think that was primary deficit, you said, or nominal primary deficit, then you're talking about a very big recession, or hopefully a very quick one. The question is first, we have two other sources of revenue, either hiking temporarily taxes or inflation. First, what do you think the inflation ramifications where we are at in the medium term are going to be, especially on the monetary and fiscal side? And then also, what about a tax increase after all this relief is not as necessary as before?
That's a very good question. No, I don't like to talk about inflation as a means to finance higher expenditure, because inflation is it's an outcome of a country, of a society that was not able to reach a consensus on how to raise taxes to pay a bill, or even how to raise revenue through higher growth to pay the bill. So inflation, I think, of course, it's a monetary phenomenon, but again, it also reflects, a kind of failure of a social pact to deal with a higher expenditure. And I don't expect that this will happen in Brazil. Pretty much, I think one of the good benefits, the positive outcomes that we had here in Brazil in the last 4 years, that we were able to cut the inflation rate very, very fast. Remember that in 2015, the inflation in Brazil was 10.7% per year, and now the inflation is lower than 3%. So, this was a very good outcome of all the reforms that Brazil did in the last 3-4 years, and I don't want to lose that. I think it's very important to continue to control inflation, to make inflation very, very low. So, we go back to the other part of the question. If you don't want to rely on inflation, so are you going to pay the bill? Do you think you need a tax increase? Again, here in Brazil, we have a problem because, as I told you before, Brazil has a very, very high tax burden. We're not a country like Chile. In Chile, you have a tax burden around 23% of GDP. So, a country like Chile can easily increase the tax revenue to GDP by 1-2 percentage point without jeopardizing the economy. Brazil is different because we already have a very, very high tax burden. So I think that probably, I would rather to rely on temporary revenue for the next 2-3 years instead of increasing tax burden. What I mean temporary revenue, you can speed up, for instance, concessions. Concession will help you in extra revenue to deal with the coronavirus bill, and privatization as well. Although privatization doesn't give you primary revenue, privatization helps you in terms of cutting the debt. So you can, speed up all these concession programs, privatization, etc., to try to pay the bill. And also, I will not start all this process by increasing the tax burden, because again, if you improve our tax system, it's not increasing tax burden, it's improving the tax system, make it more progressive. Probably this will help us, to grow faster. And if your country grows faster, this helps us as well, in paying the bill linked to the coronavirus crisis. So, I think that, increasing tax burden, nobody wants to talk about that right now. And probably I'll put that, in the worst case scenario. Before that, we have reforms to approve, and we have means to raise extraordinary revenue through concession and privatization that could help us to deal with the coronavirus bill next year.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Roberto Campos wasn't able to make it today because of the agenda at the IMF, but we have a question about the quantitative easing that's going on. I don't know if you want to venture any answer on this. Certainly there's a fiscal side as well, but you have some funding that's going into from the Treasury of the central bank to buy private debt, and state municipals indirectly, directly through you. How do you expect this to affect not necessarily the accounting of the deficit, because capital expenditure is not, buying assets is not part of a primary expenditure the way Brazil accounts for it. But how do you think this is going to affect the fiscal side, and maybe how efficient it might be to what the central bank is putting in place? They seem very similar to the programs that we have here, and they look on the face of things a way to help significantly, but the fiscal ramifications are in your area, so I'll leave it to you.
Okay, I mean, this will be a very long debate. What central bank is trying to do is quite similar to what many other central banks in the world are doing, especially in the United States, the Fed. So, I mean, what Roberto Campos wants and the central bank wants some kind of flexibility, to buy, private bonds and even public bonds as well for a short time until this crisis lasts, which is until the end of the year. After the end of the year, when you don't have this public calamity, they will not allow to do that anymore. But even to do that, only for some months until the end of this year, there is a lot of controversy. I don't think I like the idea of the central bank having more powers to deal with the crisis. Again, what we see in the United States and in many other countries is something that the central banks will not use in normal times, but now we are not going through normal times. But there is a lot of controversy. I talked myself with many former central bank presidents, and I think Roberto Campos did the same. And here in Brazil, what many people asked was, okay, if you're going to do that, if the Central Bank of Brazil is going to do that, we need to make it sure that it will be very, very transparent, that it will be very clear, and there is some kind of limit. We need some kind of ceiling. And in order to define the city, we need, some, commitment of the treasury that puts aside X billion reais, that the central bank will put some 75, 80% or more. In addition to that, X billion reais that the treasury allowed, the central bank to face risks. And that's the big challenge, because some people who were directors of the central bank, some people don't think this is necessary because it's temporary, so you can give full flexibility to the central bank, and you can, put some kind of control on the resolutions of the programs, on the rules of the programs that will be set by the central bank. But many others, economists, including those ones who were formerly the director or president of the central bank, they think that no, you need to put up front a total amount that the treasury will allow you, to deal with the budget. You need to show that in the budget. You need to show that the treasury needs to put aside 20, 25, whatever, X percent. And the central bank has a kind of ceiling to do all these operations. So this is an open debate, because this proposal was not approved yet. It was approved in the lower house, and now it's in the upper house. And in the upper house, the senators are divided into whether or not they will allow the central bank to do that. Again, I don't think this is a big problem because it's temporary. I know that we need to make it very transparent, and also that we need to make some kind of ceiling. But again, it's in a debate. And again, I don't expect that the central bank will be very active in, for instance, in buying private or even public bonds. In 2002, I don't know if you guys remember, but in 2002, a left political party was elected in Brazil. Lula was elected, and in the second half of 2002 in Brazil, there was a major crisis of trust, of confidence, And for some time, the Treasury had problems to sell bonds, and in that time, the Treasury was helped by the central bank. This is not happening right now, but because of the controls that we imposed on this public sector through the years, central bank today is not allowed to do the same that the central bank did in 2002. That's why the central bank decided to put this authorization permission in this budget for war as a means that in the worst case scenario, if we do need to do something in the secondary market to buy public bonds, we'll be allowed to do that. But I'm not expecting that the central bank will use, even if it's approved, I don't expect that the central bank will use this permission. But again, whether or not the central bank will be allowed to do quantitative easing, it depends on the approval of the Senate, and it's not clear yet if it will be approved or not.
Thank you. Yes, I think we go back to 1999 as well. There were some things the central bank was doing to try to defend the real that later became verboten. We had that big debate here over the last month or two in the United States. There were a couple of prominent people that probably should have known better, said that the Federal Reserve couldn't buy private paper. But it can. It's Section 13.2. And before the U.S. had big deficits, that's how the Federal Reserve intervened, is in private paper. So it had to be high quality. But so it's a big question because there are huge fiscal ramifications. I've gotten quite a couple questions about the real, the exchange rate, and certainly this also has fiscal ramifications, but now in the positive sense. It's been that way for quite some time because the Brazilian government is a net creditor in dollars and gets a rather large capital gain when the dollar goes up. But the question is what are you expecting for the evolution of the real over the? You expect it to keep weakening? I mean, certainly, maybe you're rooting for it. Just kidding. And what does that mean for the confidence of foreign investors? I mean, what is your sense, and we have quite a few on this call, of what foreign investors' sentiment is towards Brazil?
First of all, this is a very, difficult question to answer. There is a very famous economist in Brazil that, he already died, but he used to say that, talking about exchange rate is one of those topics that always, humiliates economists, that makes economists making wrong statements. So, it's quite difficult, especially for someone in the government to talk about the trend of exchange rate in Brazil. And second, this is a very sensitive topic because, it has nothing to do with the Minister of the Economy. It's the role of the central bank to deal with exchange rate policy and also with reserves. So, let me make very clear something, with all the due respect, something that I really avoid to talk about, it's exchange rate, reserves, and short-term interest rate, because, all these topics is linked to the central bank. And the way that the Minister of the Economy sees the central bank in Brazil, it's an independent institution. So, I cannot, because of the deep respect that I have to the central bank team and to Roberto Campos, the head of the Brazilian Central Bank, I really don't like to talk about exchange rate, reserves, and short-term interest rate. But let me stress one point. That, different from any other country, here in Brazil, we have a huge stock of reserves that is near 20% of GDP, which is very, very high, which, make us very, quite comfortable, different from any other emerging economies. And even very, very different from the previous crisis that Brazil went through during the second half of the 20th century. Remember that the Brazilian crisis in the 1980s and also the Brazilian crisis in 1999, we always had to knock the door of the IMF to ask for a loan to have dollars to pay our imports, our debt, etc. This is not the case anymore. So Brazil has a huge stock of reserves, and also 90% of our local debt, of the Treasury debt, is financed domestically. So, this is very different from, the way, that the economy used to work in 2002, in 1999, 1980s. So pretty much now, we have a very good, a very comfortable, international reserve position. That's it's something that, I don't lose my dreams about talking about exchange rate and also about reserves, because now we have, as you said, Brazil is a net creditor. When the dollar goes up, we become richer instead of poorer. It's very, very, very different from 2002. In 2002, when the dollar went up, the net debt of Brazil increased very, very fast. It's very different now because, when the dollar goes up, the immediate effect is that our net debt decreases, gets lower. So pretty much, it's a much better position, very different from the previous crisis in Brazil. But again, what will happen with the exchange rate, with reserves, etc.? It's a topic that it's to the central bank to answer this question. And again, it's not something that I can go deeper in talking about that. But, I'm sure that in a very comfortable position, and the central bank is dealing well with, all these three topics: reserves, exchange rate, and short-term interest rate.
Well, thank you for that answer, Mansueto. I'm sure our panel will take up these questions as well. And I know you're treading on a little out of your area, but thank you for that answer. We have a question about the agricultural industry. Just wondering if there's any plans in place to help agro-industry in all this, and how are they doing in this pandemic?
Which one? Agriculture?
Agro-industry, yes, agriculture.
Yeah, if there is one sector in Brazil that always gets help from the government, is agriculture. Remember that in the last 3-4 years, we cut a lot the subsidized credit to the service and also to the industrial sector, except for agriculture. Agriculture every single year has a subsidy through public banks and private banks as well. We put in their budget a subsidy to provide loans to the agriculture sector. And, when the agriculture sector in Brazil is very, very powerful, it's very good, it's a very good sector, it's very important for the country. It's one of the most dynamic sectors. If you look to the numbers of the increase of productivity in the agriculture sector in Brazil in the last 30 years, it's impressive. And of course, the government will do whatever it takes, to help any sector. But again, the agriculture sector already started the year with subsidized credit to do investments. And again, in this process, you are dealing also with old debt of the agriculture system. So, and we have a strong, public programs to help the agriculture sector was already in place before the crisis. So, I'm not too much concerned with the agriculture sector because, the agriculture sector in Brazil is doing very, very well. And I think the government can help the agriculture sector in many other ways, including, continue to have good relationship with foreign nations to open market for the agriculture sector. I think the agriculture sector is as important as many other sectors, but again, agriculture sector is always very, very important. It's always, on the radar of the public policy. So, we are going to continue to help the agriculture sector as we've been doing for years.
Good. I'm going to ask a question of my own, just real quick here, and then there's another question in the queue. What about trade? What we've seen is sort of a reaction that I think is a little bit, the word would be wrong-minded, in a number of countries. Instead of opening trade, we've seen a adherence to protectionist trade, especially with medical equipment and inputs, et cetera, that could, really sort of help things around. What has the administration done on the trade side? Certainly allowing carefully inspected, of course, imports is one way to take advantage of the fall in a number of prices, not only agricultural commodity prices. Brazil imports a lot there, but I just have a question. Has there been a stance on trade?
Right now, we're cutting some tariffs on some importers because, we need to import more. And again, I think we need to take the opportunity to cut tariffs on imports. And the benefits of trade, it doesn't matter whether or not other countries, are cutting or not, tariffs. It doesn't matter if a country is becoming more protectionist, other countries. I think, Brazil is a very big country. The total that we export and import together in relation to GDP is very, very low. I think we need to be more aggressive in terms of cutting tariffs and, and make Brazil more open to improve, to increase imports and to use here in our, in our value chains. So the benefits of being more open to trade, it does, it's independent of what other countries are doing. Of course, that we have been seeing that in the last 2 years, many countries in the world have become more protectionist, and this is very, very bad for international trade. But again, Brazil, it's a very close economy, and I think we have some, low-hanging fruits in going faster, in cutting tariffs, independent of what other countries are doing. So I think, the basic scenario is that the Brazil will continue to try, to make bilateral agreements and also to cut tariffs, to increase our productivity, to buy what is best produced all over the world and bring it to our value chains, to become, more strong in terms of exports. And in order to increase our exports, we need to import more as well. So I think that the scenario of the Brazilian economy to participate more aggressively in the global value chains, and also, to export more, we need to take the opportunity that, everybody's wanting to sell and cutting prices. You need to have the opportunity to cut tariffs and import more. I think pretty much, Max Troillo, who is in charge of this area in our economic team, he pretty much agrees with that. I think, nothing changing in our costs to become more, to become more engaged in global value chains. I think, of course, you're in the difficult time. Everybody's dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Many countries are being protectionist. You see a little bit of trade war regarding some inputs linked to the health system. But again, it doesn't change the cause. And the cause of Brazil is that we need to make a strong effort, to be more present in the world arena, in the world trade, because, again, Brazil is still very, it's still a very closed economy. And we need to continue our big efforts to become more engaged in international trade. So, nothing changing in the course of trying to become more present in the international trade arena.
That's very good. Thank you. Just two more quick questions, and then I'll ask you for your... there was a question about renewable energy. Is there any incentives for initiatives right now on renewable energy, or is that also on hold at this point, especially where energy prices have gone?
Renewable energy is a very important agenda, not only here in Brazil, but all over the world. I don't think, now we have a problem with prices, especially linked to the ethanol sector. But because, the price of the oil went down sharply, when the price of oil goes down sharply, this affects a lot of in Brazil, the ethanol industry. But, we have all the other renewable energy, wind energy, solar power energy, etc. It's very, very important. I'm not sure about the timetable of new auctions regarding this renewable energy. But, this is as important today as it was 1 year ago. I think renewable energy is the future of any economy in the world. There's something that needs to be, that needs to be on our agenda. And it's a key sector. It's that we need to give incentives, that we need to promote. So, I'm not sure, what the Minister of Mining and Energy is planning for this year. But again, renewable energy, it's very important, not only to Brazil, but to all over the world. And I think, our plans to foster renewable energy will continue.
Yes, certainly Brazil is one of the leaders in this for many decades now with ethanol. I'm going to give you, we've got a couple things, but we have to wrap up. The question is, someone thinks, some of the folks that have put commentary that you might be looking at things with a little bit rose-colored glasses, but that's your job. So maybe, maybe you should talk a little bit about what the main risks that you think especially you in particular in your job on the fiscal side, et cetera, are facing. And then finally, give us a final thought as to how what message do you want us to relate to our colleagues and so forth.
Okay, I'm not very optimistic. I'm always trying to be very real, so I don't like to look, to the numbers in a rosy way. I think 1 week ago I was talking with one of the rating agency, and my surprise was that my numbers were worse than theirs, and I then joked with them saying that, okay, I you give up my numbers and I'll use yours. So I mean, I trying to be very realistic, and of course, I mean, we have many risks. What are the risks that we have here in a country like Brazil? First, many people try to many people might have the incentive to spend too much beyond what is necessary to deal with the coronavirus crisis. If this happens, we will end up with a bill that is too high, that we need a strong effort in the future to pay the coronavirus bill. So we need to be very careful, because Brazil, it's a country with a unique position of very high tax burden, high debt, and you need to be very careful with each single cent that we need to spend to deal with the coronavirus crisis. So you need to control the ambitions of many programs, of many people that thinks that we need to do everything to help, any firm, any sector, and you don't have the means to do that. So this is a risk, but we are trying to control that. And up to now, we've been very successful. If you see the programs that Brazil put in place, it's big for Brazilian economy, but it's quite, it's not as aggressive as many other programs that many developed countries are putting in place. And because we don't have the same fiscal space. Second, of course, that at some point, I know that you have a lot of pressure to do a kind of, Marshall Plan. Many people will look to the government as, as the actual most important to help, to speed up the GDP growth after the crisis. And many will demand, a strong government support to many sectors. And, and you'll not be able to do that. Again, we don't have a fiscal space to increase sharply the public investment after the crisis. So we need to be very aware and to explain to everybody that, again, listen, we need to do the fiscal, the economic reforms, because we need private investment to help us to increase the GDP growth to pay for the bill of the coronavirus crisis. But I'm sure that you have a lot of pressure on the government to be the main actor to provide new funding and subsidize credit, to try to boost GDP growth after the crisis. But again, we need to deal with the pressure. That's the day-to-day of being a government. Third, the other risk is that, if somehow, we are well prepared to deal with the crisis, with the lockdown for 3 months. But what happens if the lockdown goes over 3 months, beyond 3 months? Then we will need to go to the table, and the bill will be even higher. But what we're seeing through the world is that nobody is spending more than 3 months in a lockdown. The people that I talked last week, they were telling me that they think that 3 months of lockdown is too long, that probably we won't need to spend like 3 months everybody here home. So let's see that. Again, there are many risks, but again, you have political pressure, that's part of the game. But what we need, to avoid really, to spend much beyond what is necessary, is have a good political debate. I really believe in the political debate. I really believe in the good sense of people. And I really believe that when you provide good information and you make the debate more transparent, I think you have allies to avoid, paying too much and doing things that is not necessary. And that's the way that I think the whole government wants to do, the whole economic team wants to pursue. We will be very transparent. We will try to make, very clear the cost of each single proposal, and try to talk and promote a very good political debate about the cost and benefit of each single program. If you do that, as a society, I think we'll be able to reach a consensus about how to deal with the crisis, and after that, we'll talk about how to pay the bill. But again, there are many risks, but I think we deal with the risk up to now. Of course, the risk and the pressure you get higher and higher, but we need to come to the table, be very calm, negotiate, and show and try to evaluate cost and benefit. I'll put in place probably next week. I'll put in place a software in the Treasury website that everybody could go daily and check how each single cent of the revenue to deal with the crisis has been spent. So pretty much, I mean, again, it's daily business. I think we should deal with the pressure, the risk, but up to now, I'm quite comfortable. Of course, we will have a higher to be paid. But again, up to now, I'm quite comfortable that will be ready to deal with the consequences and to speed up all the economic agenda reforms that Brazil needs to approve to increase our potential GDP growth.
Well, Mansueto, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us for an hour today. Really exceptional, answering all of our questions. And anything you need from us, we're at your disposal. But thank you for joining us today. It was really great.